It seems as if it's been coming for a while, but now it's finally here. This week, 100 years ago, the United States joins the war. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Toplica rebellion against Central Powers' occupation was finally crushed in the Balkans. Russia is still in a state of uncertainty after the February Revolution, and the Germans send Vladimir Lenin there from Switzerland to foment more dissent. In the Middle East, a battle took place at Gaza that resulted in a British defeat. Here's what followed. For 2 months, German unrestricted submarine warfare has been sinking shipping of any nation and any kind, and that continued. On the 1st, the American steamer Aztec was torpedoed and 28 of the crew drowned. The following day, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. On the 4th, the Senate voted 82-6 to go to war, and on the 6th, the House of Representatives voted 373-50 to go to war, and the United States of America was now officially in a state of war with the German Empire. That day, 91 German ships were seized in American ports. The U.S. fleet was mobilized and the Naval Reserve was called to colors. Congress voted an emergency war fund of $100 million. That's $3.7 billion in today's money. Getting men and material to Europe was going to take a lot of time and organization, but the wheels were now in motion. Although many Americans were in fact already fighting the war. Some had joined the British or Canadian armies, some flew for the French in the Lafayette Escadrille, or had enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. The European fighting had actually been relatively quiet for 3 months, but that would soon change. On April 6, France's military and political leaders gathered in President Poincaré's railway car to discuss General Robert Nivelle's upcoming offensive that he believed would win the war. They weren't there to talk about the planning, though, but whether the offensive would even happen at all. French Minister of War Paul Painlevé was pretty much begging for it to not happen. There were good arguments against it too. With America joining the war, maybe the French army could rest up for a while until the American forces would arrive. I mean, Germany certainly wasn't going on the offensive. They just this week finished retreating to a new improved defensive line. The uncertainty in ally Russia was another thing. Painlevé was so sure of disaster that he tried to resign from the cabinet, but he was refused. Nivelle, for his part, said that if he couldn't proceed with the offensive, then he would resign. Poincaré knew that if the popular hero Nivelle resigned, it would mean the fall of yet another government, and gave him the green light. Nivelle's offensive included the British opening the attack at Arras. Nivelle's plan had been for the British Third Army to attack south of Vimy Ridge on April 9th and break through the German lines towards Cambrai. This would be followed by a massive French attack on the 16th at the Chemin des Dames once the British had pulled in the German reserves. British commander Sir Douglas Haig had extended the Arras attack to include an assault on Vimy Ridge itself by the Canadian Corps, claiming, correctly, that he couldn't really go forward and leave this fortress in his rear. The Canadian Corps was part of Henry Horne's First Army, and he is truly the unknown general of World War I. He never wrote an autobiography or memoirs. He kept no diary. He had no biographer. He isn't even mentioned that often in the dispatches from the time. His wife even destroyed his letters. This is a shame because he was a fairly good commander. Anyhow, the Canadian Corps commander Julian Byng had spent the winter working out tactics for storming the ridge. He'd even sent his 1st Division commander Arthur Currie to study the French and German tactics from Verdun and figure out what worked and what didn't work. While pondering the problems, the Canadians mounted a series of trench raids and mining operations that gave them a fairly detailed overview of the enemy positions, though at the cost of considerable casualties. Plans had been drawn up and debated during the winter, but of course, they all had to change because of the German retreat. Although fortunately for Nivelle, the Hindenburg Line, as the Allies called the new defensive system, stopped short of the Chemin des Dames and also of the Arras sector. It pretty much bisected the ground between them. Unfortunately for Nivelle, the defenses of the Chemin des Dames had been built up for 2.5 years and were among the strongest on the whole front, and even had commanding views over the French rear. Also, The roads and railways behind the French ran the wrong way, side to side, and not up to the front. The Germans, knowing what was coming, had beefed up their manpower at the Chemin des Dames from 9 to 38 divisions. Nivelle just thought that was more to destroy. There would be a 5-day preliminary barrage, and Haig would have Edmund Allenby's Third Army attack on a 10-mile front supported by 1,700 big guns. They would also use 40 Mark I tanks in the assault. The attack would break through the Hindenburg Line and advance on Cambrai. Horn's First Army, attacking to the north at the same time, was to take Vimy Ridge. There was a precise timetable for everything. The German first line was to be taken in 36 minutes. The men would remain there until +2 hours when the big guns had been brought up. Then take the second line at +2 hours and 45 minutes. They would consolidate there until 6 hours and 40 minutes and then take the Fouchy strong point by +8 hours. This was all a 4.5-mile advance. Once this had happened, the Cavalry Corps would exploit the success. Now, if you add in the Canadian Corps and First Army big guns, you get 2,817 total artillery pieces, which was like 1,800 more than the Germans had. But the Germans had solid, experienced troops, and the defensive line facing Allenby was pretty hardcore. The British official history describes the defenses of the Arras-Cambrai road as a veritable fortress, and that would be the axis of Allenby's advance. Also, the tanks were unreliable still, would start from up to a mile behind the infantry, and they had a serious tendency to break down before even reaching the starting line. The British did have air power, 9 squadrons of between 16 and 24 planes for bombing, artillery spotting, photography, and the like, with Sopwith Pups, FE-2s, BE-2s, the premiering Bristol F-2B, and the new SE-5s, which, though very limited in number, were one of the fastest aircraft of the whole war. Thing is, toward the end of the Battle of the Somme 6 months ago, air superiority had swung back to the Germans and their new Albatros fighters. The Germans were outnumbered in the air, though, and had adopted a defensive strategy that went so far as to forbid planes to fly beyond their own front lines. This meant that when they had engine failure, which was common, they could glide down and be back in the air the next day, while for the Allies that often meant becoming a POW. The deceased German flying ace Oswald Belke had set up a system to save fighter pilot strength, with good communication with the front lines, so fighters would usually only fly when there were targets, and they flew in packs so they had local air superiority when they did fly. Last year, he had organized the first Jagdstaffel, Jasta, a dedicated fighter squadron, and wrote his 7 rules for fighter pilots. By April 1917, the Red Baron himself was in charge of Jasta 11 in the Arras sector opposite the British, and they flew the Albatros D3 fighters, which gave them the performance edge over the British. We would soon see battles in the sky between the British offensive strategy versus the German defensive strategy. Here's a wee spoiler. This month would become known in Britain as Bloody April. Anyhow, the artillery barrage for the Battle of Arras began at 6:30 on the morning of April 4th and continued for the rest of the week. And that's where the week ends, with preparations for 2 major offensives on the Western Front underway. Also this week, the first Portuguese troops reached the trenches, and on the Mesopotamian front, where the British had been advancing, British and Russian forces were now in touch at Kizil Robat. And the United States joined the war. Would that be a big deal? Now, it may, if they get troops over to Europe in force before the war can end. To train and equip 1 million or more men, and over 6 times that number were currently on just the Western Front. Would take maybe a year, maybe more, and Germany planned on winning by then. The U-boats driving Britain out of the war, Lenin driving Russia out of the war, and the rest, that would take fighting, and that would take real dedication by this point. I'm going to end with a quote I found in Martin Gilbert's The First World War. Albert Einstein wrote to a friend on the 3rd about the extreme nationalism of the younger scientists. I am convinced we are dealing with a kind of epidemic of the mind. It can be compared with development at the time of the martyrs, the crusades, and witch burnings. Just realize that whoever wins the war, the sheer hatred between nations by this time may well make any lasting peace impossible. The U.S. participation in the war might seem minor to many of you, but when you walk among the rows of crosses of American soldiers in the Meuse region in France, you might get a different perspective. We certainly did, and you can check out our episode about that right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Goran Drakulic, which is an awesome name. Thanks to your support on Patreon, we were able to visit original World War I battlefields, and we will do more of these visits in the future. See you next time.